Welcome to this fourth video in the occasional series on UI Builder for Node-RED. Please go back and see some of the other videos if you're not sure about what UI Builder is all about. Today we're going to look at a new feature, or relatively new feature in UI Builder, and this is the node called uib-tag. So here we're starting with a bit of a clean sheet, but we've already set up UI Builder itself. We've set up a link for the inputs, and we've set up some standard outputs. And here we have a blank inject and just a link back to UI Builder. We've got debug showing, and we've got this page up here on the right hand side, and I'm also showing the developer console from the browser so that we can see what's going on. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So we want to look at the UIB tag, and just going to stick that there for now, and you'll see it's got a red triangle. So let's open it up and see what we need to set. Okay, here we go. So UIB-tag is complementary to the UIB element node, but in this case, it will output any single tag or element that's available to HTML. Now, if you're not familiar with HTML, you may be asking, well, how do I find out what those tags are? And I will put these links in the description, but you can see that MDM, the Mozilla Developer Network, has a list of all of the available elements down here, lots of them. And similarly, the W3 Schools site also has a list of tags. With just slightly different descriptions, but so those are the two really good sources. So where are we going to start today? Well, we're going to start very simply, and we're going to output a button. Now, if you've already looked at UIB element, you'll know that we can output a form, which is a collection of inputs and a couple of buttons. But sometimes you just want a button on its own. And that's what we're going to illustrate here. Most of these are the same as the other zero code nodes, so you may already be familiar with them. The ID is something that will be unique on the page, so we're just going to call this button 1. Now you'll notice here that these inputs are set to text or a string, so this is just a static value. However, we, for all of these, have a number of choices that we can use, varying from inputs from a message or some context variables or some other features. Let's start simple. Where are we going to output this button to? That's what the parent's all about. So web pages are typically fairly hierarchical, so we want to choose a parent. Now, the main parent of any HTML page is the body tag, and you can see that here. Here's the body, and we could output to there, but you'll also notice that all of the standard examples from UI Builder now have this div or division with an ID of more. So we can use that instead of body. So we can just change that. Now to reference an ID, we start with a hash symbol. That unfortunately is just something you have to learn. And then we can type in the name of the ID. So this input is a CSS selector, as it says there. And this string will select that particular item on the interface. And we're going to say that this button will be the last item within that div. So if we expand this at the moment, it's just got a comment on it. But as you'll see in a moment when we output this, the button will appear within this division, so between these opening and closing tags. You don't really need to know this, but it is helpful to understand some of it. Then we have a section called content source, and the content source is what goes between the opening and closing tags. So in this case, between the opening and closing button tags. And in this particular instance, we just need a string to start with, and we're just going to call that button. We will come back to this later. And then we've got a set of possible attributes. Attributes, you can come and have a look in the reference data. There are a number of attributes for any particular tag. So for example, the A tag, the anchor tag, has an href, which tells you, tells the browser where to go to when you click on a link. In our case, we're going to leave this blank for now. We'll come back to it in a moment. And that's it. That's as simple as it needs to be. We've got rid of the red triangle. So let's put this in place now and click on deploy and then click there. And you may have seen that pop up down here. We've got a button with an ID on it, which we specified, the text, which we also specified, and the closing tag. That's it. And here's the button. And what happens if we click on the button? Nothing. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason is that we've not told this button to do anything. Because the button is not part of a form, then it won't do anything on its own. And we will come and fix that in a moment. In fact, let's do that now. To fix this, we're going to use the attributes. Now, a button, when you click it, clicks and things like that in HTML are called events. And so we need to attach some kind of action to the click event. And we can do that via the attributes. And so let's start by putting this into, not here, but we'll put it into the input. So we want message.attribs. We'll make that input. And let's at the same time change this to be message payload, and that way we can make the text on here a bit more dynamic at the same time. So each of these will come from an input message. In our case, we're just going to use a very simple inject, but obviously that could be part of a bigger flow. There we go. So we'll open this, and you'll notice that I've somewhat cheated and already made a start on some of these inputs. So let's look first of all at the payload. So the payload we set to be the content of the, or the slot text, as it's often called, of the button. So it's going to replace this. We have chosen here to use an expression. This uses some language called JSONata, which is basically a kind of dynamic version of JSON. And we've just used some very simple commands here. Some text, which goes in quotes. The ampersand adds more text to what you've already got. The format integer is going to take a number and format it as a string with a very simple way of doing that. It's just going to just do a number basically. And then we're using the random function, which produces a number between 0 and 1. So we're going to multiply that by 100 so that the output is a number between 0 and 100, formatted as a simple integer and attached to the word button. And that's it. So there we've done that. Now, you'll also notice that we've already got some attributes in here, and they also are using a dynamic function. So let's have a look at that. And here we go. So hopefully you will recognize this because it's the same functions as we've just described. But the important thing here is this part here. And by the way, if this isn't familiar to you, The easier thing to do, in fact, let's walk this back slightly. If I just take that off for a second, click that, and change that back to be JSON. So JSON is just plain a plain object with some structure to it. JSON is a standard format if you're not familiar with it. When we do that, we'll notice we get an extra tab here. And so this could be quite useful if you're not used to creating JSON and working with it, because you can add items manually here and it will update this for you. We don't need to worry about that at the moment. So let me just set this back to an expression. Format that. Oops, put the comma in and paste that back in again. Oops, too many of those. There we go. Now, the important thing, as I said, is this part here. So on click is an attribute that we're going to add to the button. And we're directing that on click function to a UIB library helper. So the UI Builder object in the front end in your browser refers to the library that's the helper library that comes with UI Builder, and you add that to your HTML, but it comes with the standard templates, and in fact you'll see it here. There it is. So that's the link to our library. As I say, that comes with the standard templates, and we're using a standard template here, the so-called blank template. So we've got a reference to the UIB, a UI Builder object, sorry, and then we've got a function that's built into that library called event send. And you may have already seen this if you've watched the video on forms. But event send is just standard, and we pass it a kind of magic variable called event. We don't have to do that. The browser will do this for you, but I always think it's best to be explicit about it. So there we have it. We're going to add an attribute called onClick, and it's when you click the button, it's going to run the code in that function. So you don't need to do any more than that. We've added a type equals button here that is recommended in the HTML standards, but you don't actually need it. And we've also added this odd looking thing here. Any attribute in HTML that starts with data dash is just treated as extra data, and we'll see how that helps in a moment. So there we have it. So those are the two things that we're interested in at the moment, the payload and the attributes. Click on done and deploy. Now let me click again. Now you'll see that the text has been updated with a number. If I click again, you'll see that changes dynamically, and that comes from the JSON arta that we've put in. You'll also see down here the button has been added to the source code. You didn't have to write that, it's done for you. If I click again on the inject, you will see it updating dynamically. And you'll notice that we've got our onClick attribute and we've got our data attribute. And you'll see the data attribute also changes as we click on the input. Okay, so we've added our onClick. So what happens now when we click the button? And unsurprisingly, we get a message that comes back into Node-RED immediately. And it has two main important properties. First one is payload. Now, if we hadn't included this data attribute down here, this payload would be an empty object. Typically in buttons, you don't tend to put data on them, but this illustrates that you can if you want to. More importantly for us in this particular example is the underscore UI property. And as you can see, this has a whole bunch of interesting and possibly not interesting attributes on it. It tells us that it's come from the event send function. It tells us the ID of the thing that was clicked on. The slot text, i.e. the text that appears in the button in this particular instance, is there. There are no properties in here. We've got all the attributes, which we can see in the source code down here. We've got what the event was in this case. We know that what that is because we've only attached this event handler to the on click. But of course, there are plenty of other events that you could be working with in different cases. And then we have some modifier keys here, and this may be of use to you from time to time. So if I hold down the Shift button and click on the button, we get another entry, and you will notice now that the Shift key property is set to true. And that would be true of all of these, and of course you can combine modifiers at the same time. The pointer type simply tells us what the kind of event trigger was. In this case, it was a mouse click. The node name is typically the tag name in uppercase. That's just where the event came from. And you'll also see the client ID, page name, and tab ID. These can be useful if you're trying to just deal with events or information to and from particular clients' pages or tabs in a browser. And this tells us that it has definitely come from the client and it hasn't been generated somewhere on the server. So hopefully you can see now that you can use this output in any ongoing flows. But you can see that the button has been triggered, and you can see which button it was that was triggered. Okay, so what else can we do? Let's have a look. Well, first of all, we set the HTML ID currently as a fixed string, so that doesn't change. And every time we click on the inject, this button is going to be replaced. It doesn't look like it's being replaced, but that's because browsers are so good at updating only what they need to update. This is not the most efficient way of doing things, but you'll not notice any difference until you get to some really, really complex pages that are being used by hundreds, if not thousands of people simultaneously. And then you might notice some loss of efficiency that you might want to think about in the future. That's not the target of this video, though. But we're going to change that to be a message attribute. And we are going to call that, what should we call it? We will call it button ID. There we go. Leave everything else the same. But message.buttonID will now set the HTML ID for this. So at the moment, it's set to button 1. Let's remember to deploy that. Let's clear that out of the way. And we'll click that. Nothing's changed. And nothing's changed because in our input, we've already set button ID back to button 1, which was the same as before. But what we can do now is we can copy that inject. Obviously, this could be some more complicated flow. Let's connect that back up. Go in here, and we will change that to button 2. And let's put, so that we can see that it's definitely different, that to button 2. Done. Deploy. So every time we press this, it's still the same button, but every time we press this, we get button 2. So we've used the same tag node to create multiple elements of the same type on our screen. We could, of course, go further. We have said that this is button, but equally, we could have set this to something dynamic as well. And therefore, we could use this one single node to create multiple elements on screen. But just reminding ourselves that this particular UIB tag, it creates a single element on screen, and that single element is not wrapped in anything. If you use the UIB element node, for example, everything that you output from there is wrapped in its own div in order to be able to keep things encapsulated and to be able to work with them easier. But when you're working with individual elements on screen, this may be a more convenient way of doing things. And the other advantage of this node is that, of course, it can produce any HTML tag at all. And that includes custom tags that are produced by things called HTML components or web components. Those are a standard modern way of working, creating more complicated elements from a single tag. And you may have seen some of my references to those elsewhere, and I've got a set of examples of those. Go and have a look at the UI Builder tag on the Node-RED discourse if you want to learn more about some of those custom tags. So it works with anything. You can produce anything using this without doing any code, and you can obviously use it in a very dynamic way using the data from Node-RED pushing across into your front end. And that's why we often call UI Builder a data-driven web application builder, because you can drive your user interface dynamically using data in Node-RED. Okay, and so that is covered a lot of stuff. Now, what I'm going to show next, I've already got a pre-recorded flow for, so I'm just going to import that flow, and I will leave a link to all of these flows in the video description so that you can play with them yourself. So in this instance, we have got multiple UIB tags. And as with the other zero code UI Builder features, you can link these together. They work together. And the output that's produced is a combination of all of these. And so that's very easy to do. We need to be able to send this back to the UI Builder node. So we just put that in there. So let's look at what this does. So first of all, this is creating a div tag. So a very simple tag, just as we see here. We're going to use that as a wrapper. And so we give it a name, an ID rather, of tag-ID of tag-div1. In this particular case, we're simply going to attach it to the body, which is the outer visible part of a web page, and we're going to put it as last. Obviously, we could change that to be last or first or some number if we wanted to position it more accurately. We're going to use the content source as message.payload, and we're going to set some fixed attributes. And this time we're going to set these right in the node. And here we have the attributes are very simply shown. We're going to set a manual style. So style uses cascading style sheets formats, which is again a standardized language, and hopefully you can work out what this means. We're going to set a border. The border is going to be 1 pixel wide, it's going to be a solid line, and it's going to be red in color. We're going to give it a bit of padding to put some space around the inside of it, and we're going to set the background color to this odd thing, which is a CSS variable, which has been predefined called surface3. And surface3 is one of the CSS variables that's defined in UI Builder's standard CSS file called brand uib-brand.css. So that is a standard feature that comes with UI Builder. You don't have to use that, but it's there if you want to use it. Okay, so we've created our wrapper, and we're going to inject some data into that wrapper, and hopefully this is fairly familiar to you again. You'll see that it's some dynamic text using our random number. So after creating that wrapper, we're going to create another element. This time we're going to create an element called HR, and HR is a horizontal rule or horizontal line, which we should be able to see in here. There it is. Thematic break or horizontal rule. It just produces a line. Okay. Now, we'll come back to this, but we've not set an HTML ID on here. And that has some consequences in the way that this will be processed, because it is quite hard to subsequently make changes to an element where you've not set the ID. It's not impossible, but it just becomes harder. But this time we've set the parent, instead of being body, we've set it to that wrapping div which we gave that ID to. So when we're selecting an ID as a parent, we prefix it with the hash symbol as part of a CSS selector. But we're still going to position it last, and we're going to leave these blank. And then the final element that we're adding is an A, which we looked at earlier, is a link. As always, we put the name of the tag in without its surrounding brackets. This one we have given an ID to. We've set it to the same parent, so it's the div, the wrapper. Yeah, again, positioned last, give it some manual text. And we've set some manual attributes here, so it'll be the same every time. Here's the href that takes us to somewhere that is simply a dummy website with a title, which is a good habit to get into, using titles. Titles give you some hover text. Can be useful for people with needing have poor eyesight and need other help reading the visual pages. Okay, so let's deploy that and let's inject. You'll notice we haven't reloaded the page, don't need to, because we're dynamically injecting this data. And there it is, that's what we've produced. The div with a border and a background color slightly different to the default, and some text in that div, which is this stuff. If we keep injecting, we'll get that changing. Then there's the horizontal rule, there it is, and the link. There's the link. I won't click on it, but you can see at the bottom that it's going to example.com, and you can see the title text there appearing as I hover over it. Okay, so that was simple enough, but you can see now how we can use multiple of the tag nodes to build up a more complicated UI. But it's still very simple, just setting one after another, and they link together. They can refer back to outer elements of the hierarchy, so we can build up the hierarchy as we need to. And of course, we've also seen how we can make a single node dynamic, by getting it to add more than one of the same kind of entry, or indeed different entries should we need to. So there's a lot of flexibility here. And of course, you can use them with the other zero code nodes in UI Builder, such as the UIB element node. So for example, you could create a form using UIB element, and then you could add some manual further elements into that form by using the tag nodes. Okay, so last thing to show then, the remove feature. So remove is very, very simple. It's a simple command, and all we need to do is send a different mode. The default mode, if we don't set one of these things, is the replace. And what replace does, as we've already seen and we mentioned earlier, it either adds the element or it replaces it. Adds it if it's not there, replaces it if it is there. But here we've said we're going to remove. So we just send that into the node and it's going to remove the link. So watch that. There it goes. It's removed the link. If we re-inject, it will reappear because we've sent the whole thing again. Now, so we can remove at different levels, of course. If we remove here, it's going to remove everything because this is the outer wrapper. So we click on that and it's removed the whole thing. However, we did get a warning, and you can see from the highlight that it's the middle of the three nodes. Can't remove this element as no HTML was provided. So there's no way for that remove to flow into this node to actually remove the element because we don't have an ID. And we can simply set an ID if we wanted to, which will get rid of that warning. And you may never come across this, but it's useful to know just in case you ever do. And that's it. That's it for now. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope it was useful to you. Please leave some comments and let me know if there are other things that you want to see. I've got a set of videos that I want to produce. Haven't had much time recently, but hopefully we'll get time to produce some more, a bit more regularly. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.